I had a difficult conversation with Nicola when I was working on Paraguay, and she looked at me and said, "You seem to be doing nothing but talking about Brazil," which is kind of how we wind up with the theme today, because I found that everything going on that I was looking at Paraguay came through Brazil, hence my turn in this direction. So Nicola today is going to speak to us about one of the things that it is actually an issue, and it doesn't get picked up a lot. Again, after you talk to the diplomats at Itamaraty, and they'll certainly raise it, but questions of labor, migration, and inequality in Brazil, and the various labor issues that are being found, and migration issues in South America. So I'll pass over to Nicola.
Okay. I'm a little bit alarmed to think that I'm responsible for this conference after that conversation so long ago, Sean. Well, it's been a great conference, so I'm very pleased. Thank you for the invitation to everybody associated with the conference, but particularly to Sean. We've been speaking over the last couple of days about the rise of Brazil in the regional context primarily, but also, I think, implicitly and explicitly about the rise of Brazil as part of a scenario of what Sean earlier on called rising powers associated with China, India, and a number of other economies. And I've very often been struck that in discussions, particularly about China and India, in that sort of context, a great deal of attention is often drawn to questions about inequality, poverty, labour standards, and particularly, for instance, in the manufacturing economy in China. The problem of poverty and the lack of skills in the vast Indian labour force, and so on and so on. And it seems to me that isn't reflected in discussions that we have about Brazil. That when we talk about Brazil, particularly in the context of that rising powers debate, some of the questions that Maruk was posing earlier on, we really haven't thought about the social dimensions of the expansion of the Brazilian economy, certainly in comparison with the kind of attention that's been given to the social foundations of expansion in China. And that is what I'm interested in and what my talk is going to focus on today. We quite often hear that Brazil is a vastly unequal society. According to figures released just last week, the fourth most unequal in Latin America. We often talk about poverty levels, particularly in the context of attempts by the Lula government and successor governments to put in place quite aggressive poverty reduction strategies. And we quite often hear about how the government has made social policy, if you like, development, a centrepiece of the regional and global projection of its power as the economy expands. The Brazilian government has made quite a big deal of styling itself as a development power, particularly in Latin America, but also to distinguish itself in a sense from China and India. You know, it's quite a clever mechanism to show that it's much more serious about things like inequality, poverty, labour standards, and so on than say the Chinese authorities have shown them to be. But it seems to me that there are two problems with this in the Brazilian case. The first is that there is a tendency in these kinds of debates to see social problems as residual problems that will be eradicated with the help of government policy, but nevertheless through structural processes as well as the economy expands. That poverty, in a sense, or that the poor are likely to be dragged up with the process of economic expansion. And the second is that this focus on social policy very rarely pays attention in academic debates, in particular to questions about labour. And that's what I want to try to take a step towards rectifying today. I want to do so through a very particular lens. And that is to think about the problem of what in Brazil, and quite uniquely, is called slave labour. As a way of thinking more generally about labour issues in Brazil and connecting them to questions about poverty and inequality and economic expansion that we're interested in. Obviously, I can't talk about the whole thing, but in the paper I focus particularly on the agricultural economy, which, as we'll see, is where the problems of slave labour are concentrated, particularly cattle farming and sugarcane production associated with biofuels. That's That's one of the key areas that has come up in several people's presentations, and that where labour problems are absolutely enormous. But also in the manufacturing economy, particularly in garments in and around Sao Paulo, there have been extensive problems of slave labour documented. What I want to do is place some emphasis on how these sorts of problems are connected with patterns of migration, both internal migration within Brazil and international migration from other parts of Latin America to Brazil. And I also want to expand the arguments to think about how the expansion of the Brazilian economy, along the lines that we've been discussing for the last couple of days, has not always led to the alleviation of poverty, and in fact quite the contrary, has often led to its reinforcement and the deepening of these structural problems with labour standards that I'm going to be talking about. So that's my stall, as it were, set out at the beginning of my presentation. My slides consist really of pictures to try to give a sense of what I'm talking about. The first question, of course, that I have to encounter is what we mean by slave labour, and really this isn't the place to get into the massive academic debates that exist on what does or does not qualify as forced labour, slave labour, unfree labour, and so on, except to say that most of it is rubbish. And particularly in the Brazilian case, or particularly the Brazilian case, I should say, provides us with a really interesting window into some of the conceptual problems in that debate, but it's really not our concern here. I do just want to make 2 points. The first is that when we're talking about slave labour in Brazil, the invocation of slavery can be problematic in as much as we use historical forms of slavery, particularly in a context like Brazil, to think about the forms that slave labour take today. And it's really not very helpful. The key to understanding slave labour today is that it has taken, if I can term it as such without the liberal connotations of transactions and market-based transactions, I should say. It has become contractual in as much as a worker enters a contract of employment's a difficult word, but nevertheless employment for a period of time in the agricultural economy, often seasonal. But the key is that this arrangement is normally short term. So it's likely to last for the duration of a season or a particular job or a couple of years associated with particular kinds of debt or whatever. But the point is that the people imposing slave labour, the people who are using the labour of the individuals, are not interested in what is the very costly business of retaining a labour force on a permanent basis. And so the churn, even when we're using the word slave labour, is very important. Somebody's quite influentially termed this contract slavery, and I think there are problems with that, but nevertheless it gives a sense of what we're talking about. The Brazilian formulation is nevertheless quite unique, and interestingly at variance with the International Labour Organization's definition of what constitutes forced labour. And that is that the International Labour Organization places emphasis on the relationship between the worker and the user of the worker's labour. And so the force, if you like, is of a bilateral character. Brazilian law defines slave labour as, and I'm quoting here, reducing someone to a condition analogous to slavery, whether by subjecting them to forced labour or exhaustive working hours, or by subjecting him or her to degrading working conditions, or restricting their movement by any means due to debts to the employer or its representatives. Degrading working conditions is precisely the criterion that the International Labour Organization rejects, but is enshrined in Brazilian law as an adequate defining criterion for establishing what is and is not slave labour. And indeed, most of the cases that have been encountered, getting on for 40,000 now in the last 10 years or so in Brazil, have essentially been defined according to that idea of degrading working conditions across the agricultural economy and in sectors like garments manufacturing. So the chart here shows that shows the preponderance of slave labour in the agricultural economy in Brazil. from 1995 to mid-2010, the last figures that or reliable figures that we have, as I said, getting on for 40,000 workers were, in inverted commas, freed from conditions analogous to slavery in Brazil, and these were overwhelmingly in the agricultural economy. This dirty list is one of the interesting policy mechanisms that the government has put in place as part of a very wide-ranging strategy against slave labour, which essentially is a means of naming and shaming companies or firms or entities that have been found using slave labour. And it is quite significant. It's not only the reputational damage, but also that federal funds to those companies are cut off. And given the dependence of firms in the agricultural economy on those transfers of funds, the effect can really be quite significant. But what I should emphasise, obviously, is that the dirty list and all of the statistics that we have reflect only what has been found. So they don't reflect the extent of the problem, or if you like, the true incidence of the problem. They simply reflect the revealed incidence of the problem. And the dirty list is also slightly unreliable because companies have become very adept now at launching very, very expensive legal appeals against their indictments by the federal or under the federal system for use of slave labour. The dirty list also corresponds with indictments for illegal environmental destruction as well. So this shows clearly that the incidence of slave labour is highest in agriculture, and the key point is that it's highest in those parts of the agricultural economy that have been most central to the expansion of the Brazilian economy, particularly in industries associated with the production of commodities, globally traded commodities, live cattle, soybean, particularly important in the relationship with China, cotton, sugar, coffee grain, and so on. Also a few products that are not yet traded as commodities but are likely to be soon. Charcoal being a really important one, and of course ethanol, the foundation of the biofuel, the central biofuel strategy in Brazil. And production, of course, oriented both to massive domestic consumption but also to export. And it's very, very significant that in all of the production networks associated with these products, export destinations across the world are included. And a number of global retailers have found themselves in real difficulty as a result of all of this. Sugarcane and soybean, I've just mentioned. The manufacturing economy I also mentioned at the beginning. The most high-profile case just recently involved the clothing retailer Zara and its parent company Inditex, that just a couple of weeks ago was placed on was suspended from the National Pact for the Eradication of Slave Labour and placed on the dirty list, where a number of workers were found to be in conditions analogous to slave labour in 2011. The other interesting one, of course, is Extractive Industries. Again, central to the relationship with China and the emerging relationship, economic relationships across Asia that we've been talking about. But a note of caution here. The last chart is companies cited on the dirty list by area of activity. This is numbers of workers freed, and you'll see there's a bit of a discrepancy. That cattle ranching on the previous chart accounted for the greatest number of companies or entities that are cited onto the dirty list, but here accounts for a rather smaller proportion, and sugarcane for rather more. And there are three reasons for this, I should say. The first is that, of course, sugarcane is concentrated in the central southern regions of Brazil that are much, much easier to get to for the labour inspectors than the very remote parts of the Amazon basin, and so it's proved much easier to locate the problems and gain, if you like, just geographical access to farms, ranches, and so on in some parts of Brazil than in others, and that's reflected here. The second thing is, of course, then that it takes vastly greater numbers of workers to effect a sugarcane harvest, hundreds of thousands at a time, compared with cattle ranching. And so, when slave labour is uncovered in sugarcane, it's likely to involve far greater numbers of people than in cattle ranching. But And here's the third reason. The government has placed a great deal of priority on trying to deal with slave labour in the sugarcane industry precisely because a big part of the projection of regional and global power and a big part of economic expansion has been associated with biofuels. The development strategy associated with the promotion in that particular sector. And so has pumped massive resources into the sugarcane sector to try to counter global perceptions in particular of significant social and labour problems in that kind of sector. So in part this is politically motivated as well, that the resources are directed where the government feels that it has the most sensitive problem to deal with in terms of global perceptions of its sustainability strategy. I've got water. Hold on. Okay. A few words then about the forms that slave labour takes in these kinds of. Let me just put this one up, and you can have a look at that while I'm talking. Across the board, as I said, the contracts into which workers enter tend to be short term, normally put in place by means of debt, which very often takes the form of an advance offered to workers as an inducement to enter a contract of employment. The element of slavery, the element of extreme exploitation, then takes a variety of different forms. Very often it is the preclusion of exit that defines conditions of slave labour rather than the conditions under which a worker enters them. So for instance, wages are either not paid or withheld until the end of the season so that workers feel that they have no option but to continue in that particular job regardless of the conditions in which they're working. The imposition of harsh, degrading, physically unsustainable working conditions that essentially act to dehumanise the workers such that they are much less likely to resist the imposition of these kinds of conditions. But in different sectors, the forms that it takes vary. So in cattle, charcoal, extractive industries, you're looking at situations of highly degrading labour conditions, physical violence, psychological abuse, curtailment of freedom. People are much more likely to be physically constrained from leaving a particular job. And of course, geographical inaccessibility is an important point. If you're working in the deepest and most remote reaches of the Amazon basin, it's going to be very difficult to go anywhere, even if you decide that you did want to leave. When we're looking at sugarcane, big problems of debt bondage in sugarcane, but also essentially it's the intensity of the manual labour that is the problem. Workers essentially are paid by productivity, how many metres of sugarcane they cut. And each year there's a number of deaths from exhaustion, from overwork, much of which is under conditions of physical compulsion to work. In garments factories you have a fairly conventional, if I can use that term, picture of sweatshop labour, and those were the conditions under which Zara was indicted, or its parent company Inditex was indicted over the course of the last couple of years. Final couple of observations just before I crack on, because I already have Sean waving at me. In the agricultural economy, workers found in conditions of slave labour are overwhelmingly male, for obvious reasons associated with manual labour. Women preponderant in activities such as harvesting, cleaning areas for plantations, cooking, sexual activities. There are reports of forced sexual labour in rural areas associated with cattle farming in particular. Workers in the garments industry obviously are overwhelmingly female. But the most important point that I want to make is that in the agricultural economy, slave labour is overwhelmingly associated with internal migrant workers, workers from the poorest parts of northeast Brazil who migrate to work in cattle farming to states like Pará, or to the central southern states associated with sugarcane production. And workers are overwhelmingly migrant workers, with all of the connotations that carries in terms of ease of the imposition of discipline control. The accommodation is always provided with the job, where workers are physically controlled within that accommodation complex, and so on. In the manufacturing industry, it's a little bit different, and it's associated, again, almost overwhelmingly with migrants from countries like Bolivia and some other parts of the Andean region. In the Zara case, 14 of the 15 workers that were at the centre of that case were from Bolivia, and the final one was Peruvian. But I also want to make another point with this, and it's not just about workers either moving around within Brazil or coming into Brazil, but it goes back to a point that Miguel was making yesterday about the expansion of Brazilian production networks. Particularly, I've been looking, across the region, but I think of particular importance into Paraguay. So as Brazilian production activities expand into Paraguay, we see huge problems of forced labour, particularly in the Chaco region, to go along with all of the other problems that Miguel was talking about yesterday. So it's not just labour standards within Brazil, it's also the ways in which the expansion of production networks has sought out particular kinds of labour forces elsewhere, and the conditions that have emerged have been the same. So, what's driving all of this? In the paper, and there is incidentally a paper, and there are a couple of related papers if anybody's interested in reading any more about this. The key point here is that the enterprises that have been found and documented as employing slave labour over the last 10 years or so are not small farms that are producing for local markets, but rather large-scale agricultural enterprises, predominantly, that are producing for national and international markets. What you very often hear in Brazil, as elsewhere, is that in global production networks or in national production networks, the problems of slave labour are less pronounced. Essentially, these are hidden problems that are associated with situations where markets are either highly localised and therefore not subjected to the same sorts of regulation, or in non-market environments. And that's very clearly not true. What we have here is a very, very strong empirical connection between global, regional, national production networks and the incidence of slave labour. And of course, household names when we're thinking about exported products. So how are these relationships established? Well, Miguel, I think, again, was talking about processes of land grab just now. The first point to make is that as cattle ranching has expanded into the Amazon, largely pushed in that direction by the expansion of sugarcane farming in the central southern regions, not only has there been a process of displacement of workers from land and the foreclosure, if you like, of access to land, but there has also been a situation in which the very act of clearing that land has been strongly associated with the use of slave labour. It's essentially slave workers who are chopping down the trees in order to make space for cattle ranching. So that's one dimension of this. But the other dimension is, of course, the normal functioning, if we can say that, of global production networks, where the very point of a production network, of a value chain, is to generate competition between factions of capital, such that particularly small producers are relentlessly squeezed in terms of conditions on price, on supply, and so on, to the extent that the premium becomes constructing, locating, appropriating a labour force with particular characteristics that essentially enable the reduction of labour costs within the overall production model. And that is common across production networks, across sectors, but is particularly pronounced in the agricultural economy, in economies like the Brazilian economy, and also in the manufacturing economy. In manufacturing, of course, we're all familiar with the idea about the big global buyers and the kinds of pressure that they can place on small producers. And so the normal functioning of value chains is particularly important. The other key seems to be outsourcing. And again, both in the agricultural economy and in the manufacturing economy, the incidence of slave labour is associated very, very strongly with the extent of subcontracting. And of course, the problem then comes with, ostensibly with illicit subcontracting, as smaller producers start to outsource without ostensibly the knowledge of some of the lead firms, or of course that is the excuse that's always made, and Zara sought to sort of mount its defence by saying that we simply didn't know that all this was going on, which was rejected by the authorities that were investigating the case. So, on the one hand, it's about economic models, how production networks work, how firms organise their operations, and so on. I'm just going to go very quickly, if you'll just permit me a couple more minutes, Sean. The point is, of course, that doesn't really explain to us how these kinds of exploitation become possible. And there we have to look to questions about poverty, inequality, if you like, the social foundations of exploitation. And I want to do that really very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, because I do have some pretty pictures. And I wouldn't want to go home without showing them. I don't know if anybody in the room needs this map, but I thought I'd leave it in there just in case. Simply because I'm going to try to show visually the connections between levels of human development and the problem of slave labour. Of course, you can see here the poor northeast, particularly around Maranhão, is, well, you'll see in just a second, actually, let me move on just to that now, the colour charts. You can see here that the deep red are essentially the key places of origin of slave workers in the agricultural economy. You can see down here in Mato Grosso do Sul, near the border with Paraguay, there's another hotspot, as it were. But essentially the picture is people moving, particularly from Maranhão into Pará, which is this deep blue area here associated with cattle ranching. And you can see the same pattern here. The reference address is simply where workers say that they are resident, which is normally a place of work. But given that these are highly mobile people, it tends to change very quickly, which is one of the problems associated with extending benefits to people who are found in these kinds of conditions. And then, of course, it maps almost exactly onto a map of human development by town. As you can see, the connections between the incidence of slave labour and the migration of people from the poorest regions of Brazil to the key cattle ranching and sugarcane producing regions is very strong. So I want to make a number of very small points about this. One is simply that the patterns of poverty are unmistakable. And if you look at both in terms of levels of income poverty and also in terms of average wages in these red areas, it's very clear that they are massively below even the national averages. But human development indicators more generally for these areas are really quite mixed, and so what you see in these northeastern towns is a lower than average level of child mortality, number of hospital beds tends to be greater, children in education and so on, and that of course is a result of targeted social policies by the government. But that's only a snapshot, from 2000. It doesn't show us how people who are working in these conditions now actually got into them, and the key here is of course education, literacy and so on, and it comes back to the points that Carlos, who I don't think is here, was making yesterday, that there may now be universal primary education coverage in Brazil, but secondary education coverage is still woeful, even by regional standards. And this shows it, that essentially about 70% of all of those who are discovered in situations of slave labour are either illiterate or with no more than 4 years of education. Interestingly, there's an improvement. If you had time to sort of look at this chart for long enough, you can see an improvement that does clearly reflect advances in education policy and in social policy. But we haven't yet seen any corresponding reduction in levels of slave labour, and that's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on to see whether there is actually any relationship between those two things. But the key finding here that I want to emphasise is that actually going through all the data, as we have, it is not the poorest of the poor that are most vulnerable to slave labour in the agricultural economy. Income poverty is a very, very unreliable guide to who is most likely to end up in situations of forced labour. And that's for the very simple reason that in the agricultural economy in particular, people are not seeking chronically malnourished people. They're seeking people who have sufficient physical condition for extremely intense manual work. And so what you're looking at is essentially that strata of working poor poor, not the extremely poor, but the working poor. The problem is that they are then much more likely to have that vulnerability reinforced by falling through the cracks of government social policy. Essentially, social policy initiatives like the Bolsa Familia and so on are measured by income poverty. And so these people are essentially unlikely to be caught up in those sorts of social safety nets, simply because their income poverty levels don't indicate that they are among the ranks of the extremely poor. And so they become much more dependent on very precarious, very unstable forms of income associated with this kind of employment, and therefore more vulnerable to slave labour. So when we're thinking in terms of policy initiatives to try to address slave labour, an emphasis on poverty reduction as the government has conceived it to date simply isn't going to work. It's not going to pick up the target groups associated with slave labour. I'll leave it there. I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about government policy and also about private sector initiatives in this area if anybody's interested in that during the questions. But I'll leave the presentation there for the time being. Yeah. No, that was actually one of the points that I skipped over in the interest of time, but also one of the points that has emerged very, very clearly in the research. You know, I'm afraid I don't have a more fancy answer than to say absolutely a very, very straightforward correlation between levels of, or between the informality of the workforce in general and problems of forced labour, slave labour, trafficking and so on. But that's across the board, not just in Brazil. So a lot of this research emerged, not all, but emerged as part of a bigger comparative study with India, looking at similar problems in the manufacturing economy there. And again, apart from outsourcing, subcontracting and so on, the key was essentially that as in Brazil, the people who were most vulnerable to this sort of thing were universally working in the informal economy, unprotected, unregistered, and so on.
Yeah, but essentially my question was whether that universe of workers, whether it has been reduced during the
No, absolutely not. Again, across the board, I mean, this is a sort of global process. What we have seen is a reinforcement of informality rather than alleviation of informality. And a part of that, of course, is just that idea about the normal functioning of production networks, that the kind of labour force that has been constructed is overwhelmingly informal, disenfranchised, feminised, associated with migrant workers in particular, who are more vulnerable, more easily exploitable, and so on. And so in Brazil there has been no reduction in informality. We've seen some degree of expansion of the workforce in absolute terms, but certainly not any degree of any reduction in the proportion that is informal. I think in urban areas it's still 60% informal. I think in rural areas now it's very, very much higher than that, although of course adequate statistics aren't in plentiful supply. Okay, let me start with that one and work backwards. Yes, we've observed patterns like that all over the world, and in fact in very many cases they have been explicitly sanctioned for that purpose. That the whole point of constructing a labour force that consists of migrant workers is that their ability to press particular demands or to negotiate wages or whatever is severely undermined. There's an interesting parallel with what you're saying in Hong Kong, where over the last couple of years the government brought in legislation to guarantee the minimum wage for domestic workers from other parts of Southeast Asia, but not for local workers. And the point here was, of course, that the big debate was about how migrant workers, particularly from the Philippines, were coming into Hong Kong. They were willing to work for, willing being a loaded term, and I certainly don't mean with those connotations, but willing, for whatever reason, to work for wages that were much less than local workers would work for, and therefore were favoured by employers. And so they brought in legislation to guarantee the minimum wage for migrant workers. And of course there was uproar because the local workers were saying, well, we're not receiving the same guarantees as foreign migrant workers who are arriving from the Philippines and so on. But it was precisely to try to tackle that sort of problem. It hasn't worked. Mainly because the middle classes are so upset now with the idea of actually having to pay the minimum wage that they have launched quite a vocal political opposition to that kind of regulation, and basically saying, well, if there are people who are willing to work for those wages and people who want to employ them, under those sorts of conditions, then why would you be stopping us? So the point is that across the world there are those sorts of debates about the extent to which it can be said that incoming migrant workers undercut standards for local workers, or the extent to which what we need is simply higher levels of regulation across the board so that all workers are essentially treated equally. And then that, of course, gets into debates about immigration and so on that are particularly unpleasant in many parts of the world. What sorts of strategy, if not income poverty? Well, it obviously, you have to take a multidimensional approach to dealing with poverty, not simply assessing need on the basis of income, but also thinking about education, social services, the coverage of institutions, if you like, but also labour regulation is really important. The sorts of conditions under which people work, which doesn't necessarily mean formalisation. Even though trade unions, of course, argue for that. It simply means the extension of protections. And that is, of course, easier said than done, particularly where it's very, very difficult to find the workers that you actually need to get to, because they're working in these conditions in very, very remote areas, in the case of cattle farming in the Amazon, for instance. So it can't, the point is that you need to take a much broader approach to poverty reduction, and think about insecurity of income, insecurity of employment position and so on, alongside very, very basic indicators of household income, which is what the government focuses on. And then slave labour, well, we could talk forever about this. As I said, the Brazilian definition is unique, in as much as a lot of other governments in their national legislation and the International Labour Organization reject the idea of bad working conditions as being essentially synonymous with slavery. And of course, that's absolutely right. But I think the kind of picture that you sketched of slave labour isn't actually the sort of picture that we're looking at. You very, very rarely come across situations in the productive economy, in the sorts of sectors that I'm talking about, where people are kept for the simple reason that it's very, very expensive to do so. But people want contract workers for a short period of time to do very, very intense manual labour in agriculture for a period of harvest or whatever, and they're not sort of owned. There aren't the structures of personal dependence that defined slavery in previous historical periods. So that's the point. Modern day slavery, if you want to use that language, slave labour as the Brazilians like to call it, I always put that in inverted commas because I think it is problematic. Forced labour, worst forms of exploitation, whatever language you want to use, are not the same as historical forms of slavery, although you do find some of those elsewhere in the world. But in the productive economy, in the mainstream of global economic activity, those aren't the forms of slavery that arise. So there is a problem, of course, about whether we do need to construct a separate category of forced labour, which is somehow different from, in inverted commas, normal labour exploitation. And I think it's really problematic to do that. I think you have to see it as a part of a continuum. Otherwise, you simply end up with increasingly futile attempts to place, somebody or a set of working conditions on one side or the other of a dividing line that simply doesn't work. I would dispute very strongly the idea that it's about a denial of autonomy. In certain respects it is, and that's normally about somebody being prevented from leaving a relationship, but it's very, very rarely about the conditions in which they arrive in it. There are all sorts of forms of deception that go on, but some people, some of the workers that we interviewed in this particular project and go on talking to, essentially say that they had some knowledge of what they were getting themselves into, but it's that or destitution, that's the choice. And they are likely to be paid something, not always what was promised, but something at the end of the season. and wages are withheld until then to make sure that they stay around to do the work. So they're saying that, particularly in sugarcane, for instance, where it's paid by productivity, if I work really hard, by the end of a season, a 3-month season or 4-month season, I could earn 3 times the minimum wage, and that is enough as an incentive for them to enter this kind of relationship. The point is, and I think this is where Brazilian government legislation is really interesting, and it essentially says that doesn't matter. Whether somebody chose this because compelled by whatever set of circumstances doesn't matter. We have still to be able to say that these are gross forms of exploitation and simply can't be tolerated. Well, this is music to my ears. I'm actually just about to start writing a paper on this because I promised it for a conference. And it was a point that I did make very, very fleetingly in the paper that comes out much more in the written versions or the written sort of products from this kind of study, but absolutely couldn't agree more. Just from the very fact that the people who are chopping down trees in illegal logging activities are almost uniformly slave workers, or people working in conditions analogous to slavery, to use the terminology of the legislation. All of the activities in which slave labour is concentrated are also those associated with environmental destruction on a massive scale, in terms of whether it's illegal clearing of land for cattle ranching, or illegal logging of whatever description, or, as you say, charcoal production, which ends up in the steel industry and in all of the appliances that are both for domestic consumption but also exported. The automobile industry, airline, whatever the industry is called, where they make aeroplanes, aero industry, and so on. And so this is precisely the point. And those really close connections between environmental destruction and slave labour in the agricultural economy really aren't explored very much. And it's interesting that what you find is that companies like Walmart Brazil, Carrefour, Pão de Açúcar, and so on, are all very, very, very keen to be pushing this sort of sustainability agenda, but their attention is almost entirely, although it's beginning to change, not least because there are some fantastic NGOs in Brazil who are simply forcing the issue at every turn. But they want essentially to focus on environmental destruction, and some of them will say, sort of off the record, well, we think that if we focus on that, it's a bit easier, and we're also likely to pick up labour issues at the same time. But labour issues are going to be much harder for us. Obviously, because then you run into all sorts of questions about the kind of production model, the profit model, on which all of these industries are based. And so they're much more reluctant to talk about sustainability in terms of labour issues, but they sort of think that they, at least in the Brazilian case, that they might kill 2 birds with 1 stone if they focus on the environment, which of course isn't true, but nevertheless is. But I'm just about to start writing a paper on that, so if you had any further thoughts, then they'd be most welcome. Yeah, and the first point that has always to be made, in discussions about these things, is that the construction of a model based on a global transnational production networks or the massive expansion of the Brazilian economy don't in themselves create problems with slave labour. And there are a lot of people who of course think that as I said too quickly in the paper, who think that it's precisely in these sorts of economic models where the problems are likely to improve the most, because regulation is more advanced, because firms are worried, particularly big branded firms are worried about reputational damage when they're found to have slave labour in their supply chains, or to be associated with environmental destruction or whatever, that doesn't seem to work, and it doesn't work for all sorts of reasons. I think that connection, one of the problems is that we simply don't know we never had data before. We didn't have data 20 years ago that we can compare with the data that are being produced now. And so we've simply no idea what the scale of the problem was, and actually no idea what the true incidence of the problem is now. All that these figures reflect is what has been found, which may or may not be a tiny fraction of you know, the universe, if you like, of the problem. So it's difficult to know whether things have improved in a sense or not. You could say, well, 37,205 people, you know, over that period of time between 1995 and 2010, that must be progress. Well, to an extent, except that we don't know what kind of proportion that represents of the total number of people who are working in these conditions. The other problem is that there is an extremely high incidence of what, again to use this terminology which I don't like, but let's use it because it's used in Brazil, of repeat enslavement, that people are freed. And the interesting thing there is that they are legally obliged to be freed. And workers very often come into conflict with the federal labour inspection teams when this imposition is enforced, or this obligation is enforced rather. But they're obliged to be freed. They get unemployment benefit for 3 months, and then nothing. And very, very often, the labour inspection teams reported, you know, both sort of informally, but it also appears in their formal reports as well. You know, they will, in inverted commas, free the same person over and over and over again, year after year, simply because somebody's options are so limited that they simply end up in the same kind of situation. The recruitment networks are sophisticated, people are found again, and so on and so on. And so it's very difficult to know, under those circumstances, whether 37,000 people represents real progress with the problem or not. Clearly, though, the Brazilian government is trying to do something about it, which is very different from a lot of governments in the world. And so you have to think that the greater attention to the problem, the greater visibility that is given to these sorts of issues that are associated with slave labour might mean that at least we're moving in the right direction. But that's probably the best that we can say at the moment.